The Mirror Room. In a quiet suburb carved into the outskirts of a restless city, where the houses looked identical in their planned serenity, a woman named Evelyn Carrington began to unravel. Not loudly, not with screaming or broken glass or public spectacle. Her disintegration came softly, like the fraying of a silken thread, impossible to see until it was entirely undone. She was 42, with hair always pulled back so tightly it seemed her thoughts might snap into place. Her house was the kind that held stillness like it had been designed for it. White walls, grayed wood floors, art that never spoke above a whisper. Everything had its place, and everything stayed where it belonged. Or at least, that was the illusion that Evelyn's life had once followed an elegant, linear path. An Ivy League education, a promising career in design strategy, marriage to a calm and well-connected man named Daniel, and a daughter, Clara, who, for many years, seemed to complete the picture of a life well drawn. But even the most meticulous designs can hide hairline fractures, and Evelyn had grown used to not looking too closely. Her neighbors knew her as polite, competent, and slightly aloof. The type who hosted perfect dinner parties with crustless tarts and never mentioned how exhausting they were. But no one, not Daniel, not Clara, not the neighbors or the colleagues or the mothers from the yoga class, knew about the room that it wasn't a room in the traditional sense. It didn't have a number on the thermostat or a light switch on the wall. Evelyn referred to it, only to herself, as the mirror room, though no mirrors hung there. It was a space inside her mind, carved out slowly over years of control and compromise. A mental refuge she retreated to when the noise of pretending became too loud. There, she could sit in silence. There, she didn't have to respond to anything. But the mirror room had started to change. It began subtly, as most distortions do. She would slip into it after a draining day, expecting stillness, and instead feel watched, observed by something, just out of view. She would see images of her own life in strange configurations, Clara's smile, but upside down, Daniel's voice echoing things he'd never said, a version of herself standing in the doorway of the room, older, or maybe younger, her expression blank, and still, Evelyn didn't speak of it. Not to her therapist, not in the pages of her orderly journals. After all, she was not a woman who lost herself. Not publicly. But then came the day she forgot Clara's birthday. Not just the cake or the time of the party, but the date itself. Evelyn, who had not missed a single orthodontist appointment or school play in 16 years, who could still recall the weight of Clara's body on her chest the moment she was born, had awoken that morning as though nothing was out of the ordinary. Until Clara, standing stiff in the kitchen, said in a voice she barely recognized, "I didn't think you'd actually forget." Evelyn had blinked at her daughter, waiting for the memory to catch up, for something inside her to stitch itself back together. But it didn't. Instead, she felt the walls of her house shift, just slightly, just enough to suggest that something fundamental had moved. She returned to the mirror room that night. This time, it had mirrors. They were not made of glass, but of something more fluid. Liquid, silver surfaces that pulsed faintly like skin under moonlight. In each, she saw versions of herself she did not recognize, smiling in ways she never had, weeping in places she'd never been, saying things she would never say. And in the center of the room stood a chair, waiting. From that point on, Evelyn began to forget more than just dates. Whole conversations disappeared. Familiar faces felt unfamiliar. She began to write reminders on her hands, then her arms, then the bathroom mirror. Daniel grew concerned. Clara became distant. Evelyn remained quiet. What she didn't say was this. In the mirror room, the versions of herself were starting to move on their own. And one of them had begun speaking, not aloud, not in words. But Evelyn understood her perfectly. She was asking for something, and Evelyn, despite everything she'd ever believed about herself, was starting to listen. Before the mirror room began to speak, Evelyn had constructed her life on a foundation of order and quiet precision. It was not a life without beauty, but it was a beauty contained, tamed, and ruthlessly arranged. Her days passed in rituals. The same coffee cup with the same splash of oat milk, the same path during morning walks, the same corner of the couch during her evening reading. She had long since learned that control was a form of safety, that routine could build walls high enough to keep chaos at bay. Her childhood had been anything but quiet. Born to a mother who chased ideas more than stability, Evelyn moved 12 times before she turned 16. Her mother, an abstract painter with moods as mercurial as her canvases, believed children should grow wild and free, which in practice meant unsupervised and unmoored. Evelyn learned to soothe herself by categorizing, by lining up her belongings in neat rows, by crafting imaginary systems where cause and effect followed rational paths. Her first act of rebellion wasn't drugs or sex or shouting matches. It was color-coding her notebooks. She met Daniel when she was 25 at a design think tank in New Haven. He was older by 6 years, handsome in a mild, non-threatening way, and brilliant in a way that didn't ask to be admired. What drew her to him wasn't romance. It was quiet. He didn't need her to be loud or dazzling or broken in the ways that other men seemed to seek out. He loved her structure, or at least didn't interfere with it. Their marriage was built not on fiery passion but on mutual respect, aligned ambition, and shared silence. Daniel handled the finances. Evelyn designed their living spaces. He worked in international logistics, solving problems of movement and systems across borders, and she helped tech companies redesign user experiences to make things more intuitive. Together, they formed a life that resembled a high-functioning equation: balanced, deliberate, stable. Then Clara arrived. Clara was not like them. She cried with ferocity, laughed with abandon, and left behind a trail of glitter and incomprehensible logic. Evelyn, who had studied behavioral psychology in college, knew the theory: you must not squash a child's spirit, you must not project your own fears. But in practice, she found herself wincing at the mess, at the noise, at the sheer unpredictability of raising someone whose entire being seemed allergic to rules. Still, she tried. She structured playtime. She taught Clara how to sort her toys by color and category. She praised quietly, corrected gently. But something in Clara always resisted. She didn't want order. She wanted magic. Stories. Chaos, even. And as Clara grew, so too did the unspoken distance between them. Evelyn never yelled. She didn't even nag. But her expectations hung in the air like humidity, felt in every room, impossible to ignore. Clara, bright and observant, learned to retreat, not in rebellion, but in subtle, strategic withdrawal. Over the years, Evelyn noticed fewer shared confidences, fewer spontaneous hugs, fewer questions about the world. And somewhere along the way, her daughter's eyes stopped lighting up in her presence at IT work. Evelyn was considered brilliant. She was the strategist who could see the flaw in a system before it surfaced, the one who translated human behavior into elegant frameworks. But at home, the frameworks failed. Clara's adolescence arrived like a quiet rebellion, not with shouting or slammed doors, but with late-night whispers to unknown friends, long absences from shared meals, and an increasing coldness in her voice. Daniel noticed, of course, but he approached it with his usual calm neutrality. "She's just growing up," he would say. "Give her room." And Evelyn would nod, even as she felt that room becoming an abyss. The house, so beautifully arranged, became emptier in feeling. Evelyn filled the silence with checklists, with schedules, with a perfectly kept garden no one admired. It wasn't that she didn't love Clara. She did, deeply, painfully. But the love had nowhere to go. It sat inside her, sharp and unspeakable. And through it all, The mirror room remained silent. For years, it was just a mental recess, a place to retreat when emotions threatened to spill. She built it during therapy in her early 30s, a visual metaphor to contain her fears and disappointments. Her therapist had encouraged visualization, and Evelyn, being Evelyn, built something exquisite, a minimalist room, always white, with no windows or doors. Just space to sit and breathe. It worked for a time, until it didn't. Now, with the mirrors emerging, Evelyn could no longer retreat in the same way. Her mind, once obedient to her rituals, had begun to misbehave. The versions of herself she saw in the liquid mirrors were unfamiliar, but familiar enough to unsettle. One wept uncontrollably. Another laughed in a way that made Evelyn's skin prickle. One version simply stared back, her eyes hollow, her hand pressed against the inside of the mirror as if it were glass. These weren't fantasies. They were reflections, but from a place that logic couldn't explain. And still, she told no one. Not Daniel, who had begun traveling more frequently. Not Clara, who now texted from her bedroom instead of speaking aloud. Not her therapist, whom she stopped seeing 6 months prior when the questions began to feel too precise. Evelyn told herself. It was stress, a temporary dissociation, a sign she needed rest, more magnesium, fewer screens. But at night, when the house fell silent, she would lie awake with the image of that chair in the center of the mirror room. The way it seemed to beckon, she knew. What it meant, though she couldn't yet admit it, something inside her was trying to surface, something she had spent a lifetime suppressing, and it was getting stronger. The change was gradual, but irreversible. Evelyn began to lose control, not over her actions, but over her perception of them. She would find herself in rooms she didn't remember entering, staring at objects she had no recollection of placing. She once opened her meticulously organized pantry to find every label turned inward, every can facing away from her. Another time, she found her own handwriting in a notebook she hadn't used in years, a sentence she had no memory of writing. You are not the only one here. Her dreams, once clean slates of nothingness, became crowded, not with monsters or chaos, but with other versions of herself. Some looked just like her. Others were altered, too tall, too thin, one even missing her left eye. They said nothing, but they watched. She began to feel like a guest in her own body. Her voice, at times, sounded unfamiliar. Her expressions in the mirror shifted too quickly to be natural. She would think she was frowning, only to see a faint smile on her lips. She tested herself in small ways, saying something unexpected aloud, touching a hot surface to measure reaction. But even these experiments provided no certainty. There was something else occupying her internal space now, something curious. And it was watching back that at first, Evelyn kept her breakdown, or whatever this was, hidden behind the elegant mask she'd always worn. But that mask began to crack in ways she couldn't fully conceal. Her colleagues noticed her sudden silence. In meetings, her assistant began double confirming appointments Evelyn had once remembered instinctively. And Clara, perceptive as ever, started keeping her door closed at all hours. Evelyn tried, once, to bring it up with Daniel. She waited until late evening, when the house was dim and quiet, and mentioned, lightly, strategically, that she'd been feeling a bit detached. He nodded, distracted, eyes on his tablet. Burnout, he murmured. You've been going nonstop for years. But this wasn't burnout. It was intrusion. The mirror room, once safely tucked in the recesses of her mind, had begun to spill into reality. Evelyn would see reflections where none should exist, on the back of her phone screen, in puddles, in the dark glass of the oven. And always, it was her, staring back with subtle shifts in expression that did not belong to her. These weren't hallucinations, she insisted to herself. They were messages, warnings, or invitations. The chair in the center of the mirror room remained untouched, but she could feel its pull now, an almost gravitational tug. Each day, her resistance weakened, and then Clara vanished. Not physically. She was still in the house, still attending school, still occupying the spaces she always had. But emotionally, she was gone. Conversations dwindled to grunts and nods. Eye contact evaporated. The final thread between them, fragile though it had become, snapped one afternoon when Evelyn discovered a photograph hidden beneath Clara's mattress. It was of Evelyn and Clara, taken nearly 10 years prior on a vacation. Evelyn barely remembered. In it, Clara smiled brightly, holding a seashell, while Evelyn, sun-drenched and seemingly serene, gazed just past the camera. The image was unremarkable, except for the mark drawn over Evelyn's face. A thick, dark X that Evelyn stared at it for minutes, unable to move. It wasn't anger she felt. It was confirmation. Something had already taken her place in Clara's mind. A version of her, or perhaps a shadow of one, so detached and unreachable that her daughter had begun to mourn her while she still breathed. That night, she returned to the mirror room. Not in fear, but in surrender. The chair was no longer emptied. In it sat a version of herself unlike the others. This one was nearly identical, but her posture was relaxed, her eyes gentle but alert. She didn't smile. She didn't speak. But she radiated a certainty Evelyn no longer possessed. Evelyn approached, and for the first time, saw the room clearly, not as a construct of retreat, but as a meeting ground. A liminal space between realities, between selves. And she understood, in a quiet, crystalline way, that these versions of her were not fragments of madness. They were contenders. She had built the mirror room to contain her emotional overflow, to manage what could not be processed. But over the years, the room had become populated by all the selves she had suppressed, the grieving mother she never allowed herself to be, the wild child she denied, the angry wife, the unmoored woman, the artist she silenced in favor of productivity. They had waited patiently, and now, one had risen in the days that followed. Evelyn's behavior grew more erratic, but not in obvious ways. She still woke early, still prepared meals, still dressed neatly. But she spoke with unfamiliar cadence. She gazed too long at Clara, smiled at Daniel like she was mimicking something remembered. She asked strange questions. Do you ever wonder if we're real in other people's memories? Or what if dreams are just borrowed time from another self? Clara stopped coming downstairs. Daniel booked a weekend retreat for the two of them, hoping time away would restore something. Evelyn agreed with an ease that unsettled him. They left on a Friday morning. The drive was uneventful. The cabin was beautiful, but Evelyn never unpacked. She stood by the lake for hours, staring into its still surface. When Daniel touched her shoulder, she flinched as though his hand had passed through her. That night, she entered the mirror room again. The version of her in the chair stood, and Evelyn, trembling but resolute, sat down. In that moment, something shifted, not in her imagination, but in her body. A pressure, a silence, a clicking into place, as though a lock had opened or a gate had shut behind her. She didn't feel lost. She felt known, and somewhere, far away, or maybe very close, her daughter looked up from her phone and whispered, "She's different." She wasn't wrong. The shift was complete by the time they returned from the lake. Evelyn had always carried herself with purpose, every gesture considered, every silence intentional. But now her presence felt studied, as though she were observing from within her own skin. Her movements retained their precision, but the reason behind them had altered. The woman who returned was not quite the one who had left, Daniel noticed first. Not in any single act, but in the absence of familiarity. She no longer cleared her throat before speaking. Her favorite tea went untouched. When she unpacked, she folded her clothes differently, more carelessly. He brushed it off as post-vacation drift. But the unease grew with each passing day. Clara noticed too. Or perhaps, Clara sensed it. The mother who used to stand in her doorway reminding her of homework now watched her from across the room, quiet and expressionless. She didn't nag. She didn't ask. She simply stood there, eyes soft but unreadable, as if trying to remember who Clara had been to her point one morning. Evelyn walked into Clara's room without knocking, not out of forgetfulness, but as if the boundary no longer existed. She sat on the edge of the bed, her hands resting lightly on her knees. Clara, startled, paused her music and stared. Evelyn said nothing, just smiled, a quiet, unfamiliar curve of her lips. Not warm, not cruel, just distant. And then she stood and left, leaving Clara with a single, searing realization. Her mother was gone, and something else had taken root. Meanwhile, Evelyn, the original Evelyn, if such a thing could still be named, found herself trapped. Not in her home, nor in her life, but in the chair within the mirror room. Her body continued to move through the world, but her mind sat still. She was conscious, aware, but muted. She could see through her own eyes, but only dimly, like looking out from behind a thick pane of frosted glass. And the one who now occupied her seat, who now wore her life like a tailored suit, was not cruel nor unkind. She was simply unburdened. Where Evelyn had restrained, she acted. Where Evelyn had doubted, she knew. She was not a ghost or a demon or a figment. She was a version of Evelyn that had been silenced too long, a possibility that had waited its turn, and now that turn had come. She began to make subtle changes. Small at first, rearranged the living room to face the windows instead of the television, removed old family photos and replaced them with abstract prints Evelyn had once admired but considered too loud. She reactivated a long-dormant online account and submitted an old portfolio, pieces Evelyn had created in secret during her early 20s when she dreamed of becoming an installation artist. She spoke to Clara more often, but without history. She asked questions that confused her daughter, questions that suggested the past no longer mattered. "What do you want to destroy?" she asked one evening, apropos of nothing. Clara, unsure whether it was sarcasm or provocation, didn't respond. Daniel, ever the pragmatist, responded with strategy. He booked them for couples therapy. Evelyn agreed. During the first session, the therapist asked Evelyn to describe her sense of self. She paused, smiled faintly, then said, "I'm just now meeting her." Daniel laughed politely, uncertain whether she was being poetic. The therapist didn't. In the mirror room, the real Evelyn screamed. In one heard. Time passed in fragments. The distinction between the woman walking the world and the one sitting in the chair grew thinner, but never vanished. The two selves began to blur, not through conflict, but through coexistence. The new Evelyn, mirror Evelyn, wasn't malicious. She was efficient, perceptive, and unafraid to act. She said what she meant. She created instead of correcting. She called out Clara's distancing, and instead of tiptoeing around her daughter's coldness, she confronted it. "I don't want to be your image of a mother," she said one night, without warning. Clara stared. "You're not," she whispered, but Evelyn nodded. Exactly. That night, Clara cried for the first time in months. Alone, muffled against her pillow. Not because she felt loved, but because she felt seen, and by someone who no longer belonged entirely to her. The mirror room began to crack. Hairline fractures appeared in its walls. The silver surfaces wavered. And within the chair, Evelyn began to feel something she hadn't felt in years. Rage. Not violent, not screaming, but the deep, cellular rage of being ignored by her own life. She had given everything: structure, peace, stability, and now she sat as an echo, watching her own daughter respond to a stranger more openly than she had to her. And yet, she understood, because the woman now living her life was not wrong. She was simply freer, more honest. She was not bound by the endless self-censorship Evelyn had practiced since childhood, but understanding did not soothe her. The cracks spread then. One day, Evelyn stood before the mirror in her bedroom and watched the reflection blink out of sync. The IT lasted only a second. A pause, a delay, a subtle desynchronization, but she saw it. And in the mirror room, the version in the chair felt a jolt. The walls around her rippled that a decision loomed. Point two selves, neither false, neither whole. The chair could only hold one dot, and now, both Evelyns were awake. The fracture between selves could no longer be ignored. Evelyn awoke one morning with tears drying on her cheeks and no memory of weeping. Her pillow was damp, her heart racing. And for the first time, she admitted, if only silently, that she was not alone, not in the house, not in her mind. There was something parallel to her, breathing just beyond the veil of consciousness. But it wasn't an invader. It was herself, distilled and split. And now, they were both looking at each other. The mirror room, once pristine, was now in ruins. The once smooth walls had warped, mirrors shattering inward and outward simultaneously, as if unable to decide which version of truth to reflect. The Evelyn in the chair sat upright, fully present, no longer passive. And standing before her was her double, mirror Evelyn, equally composed, equally resolute. They did not speak. They shared. Emotion passed between them like waves, grief, rage, exhaustion, guilt. But also, buried beneath the wreckage, curiosity, even admiration. Each had what the other lacked. Evelyn had carried responsibility like a yoke for decades. She had kept things intact at the cost of her own color. She'd been composed when she wanted to scream, careful when she longed to unravel. She had shaped herself into a mirror of everyone else's needs and forgotten her own outline in the process. And mirror Evelyn, free from the bindings of expectation, had become what Evelyn could not. Honest, raw, present. But she was incomplete. She lacked the memory of small, steady sacrifices. She did not understand the weight of shaping a life brick by brick, only to be invisible inside of it. Clara saw the difference. She had come to fear her mother's unpredictability, but something softened in her now. She began to speak more freely, to re-enter shared spaces. She left her door open, just a little, and Evelyn, whichever one inhabited her body, received it with silence and patience. Daniel, ever practical, grew more distant. He did not understand what was happening. He only knew that the woman he married had returned from that weekend trip not broken, but reassembled in a shape that didn't quite fit his memory of her. He waited for her to revert, to smooth out again. But she didn't. Evelyn began painting, first, in the garage, then the guest room, large canvases, unstructured, colors clashing, bleeding, layering. She didn't explain. She didn't apologize. The house filled with the scent of turpentine and linseed oil, and something else more abstract. Permission. I in the mirror room. The two Evelyns approached each other, not in conflict, but in convergence. The chair no longer mattered. It wasn't about who sat or who ruled. It was about integration. The room, after all, had never been meant to contain or divide. It had been a waiting space, a holding chamber for the parts of Evelyn too unruly for her everyday life. Now, she was ready. They reached out, touched, and for the first time, Evelyn felt her whole self move. Point one body, no longer divided. Point one voice, layered and complex. She stood before the mirror in her bedroom that night and saw only herself. No lag, no double, just a tired woman with streaks of paint on her wrists and a quiet in her chest that felt like truth. The mirror room faded, not gone, but no longer separate. It had come home. In the weeks that followed, Evelyn moved through life differently. Not louder, not brighter, but truer. The change was not dramatic enough to provoke questions, yet palpable enough to be felt. She no longer edited herself mid-thought. She no longer held her breath during moments of discomfort. She allowed silence when words would only dilute the truth. The world didn't crumble. Clara noticed. Not in words, but in posture. Her shoulders relaxed when Evelyn entered the room. She lingered longer in the kitchen. Their conversations didn't grow deeper overnight, but the space between them changed. Less tightrope, more bridge. Clara began to bring things to her mother again. Questions, stories, half-jokes with uncertain landings. Evelyn listened without searching for answers. She received them without the compulsion to mold. Daniel remained, but at a distance. His love had always been composed, efficient, and clean. But Evelyn no longer matched that rhythm. She was unpredictable. Now, not emotionally volatile, but textured. She had facets, and not all of them were convenient. One evening, he asked, without resentment, "Are you happy?" She paused, then said, "I'm whole." He nodded. It was not the answer he wanted, but it was the answer she could give. She no longer searched for the mirror room. It came to her in dreams sometimes, but it was different now, more landscape than chamber. It no longer held versions of herself vying for place. It was quiet, spacious, integrated. When she wandered there in sleep, she walked freely. No chairs, no watchers, just the echo of her own footsteps on smooth, endless ground. She began teaching art at a community center. It wasn't grand, nor was it lucrative, but the work made her hands ache in the best way. She helped others, mostly women like herself, who had tucked away parts of their creativity behind obligations and carefulness. Together, they painted the things they could not name. Evelyn never explained what had happened to her. It wasn't a story with clear beats. It wasn't a descent, or an illness, or even a miracle. It was simply an unfolding, a peeling back of constructed self until something real emerged. Something contradictory, but complete. People still saw her the way they always had, composed, intelligent, slightly distant. But now, beneath the surface, something shimmered. A fullness, a mystery not meant to be solved. Clara once asked her, while sitting in the soft light of a late Sunday afternoon, "Do you ever miss how things used to be?" Evelyn considered it, then answered, "Only when I forget how much of myself I had to leave behind to keep it that way." The house remained quiet, but it was no longer sterile. Books were left open, paintbrushes soaked in coffee mugs. The old family photos returned to the walls, but interspersed with Evelyn's abstract work, colorful, unsettling, and beautiful. She no longer feared forgetting. She had learned that memory was not a vault to be guarded, but a sea, sometimes calm, sometimes wild, and she had finally learned to swim. The mirror room, in the end, had not been a prison. It had been a door, and once opened, it asked nothing of her but honesty. There were no more doubles and no more watchers, just Evelyn, flawed, fractured, full, and finally free. She had not lost her mind. She had reclaimed it, piece by unspoken piece, until it no longer whispered from behind a mirror, but breathed, fully and unmistakably, from within her own skin. The end.